Welcome to Inside the Canopy Files, a production of Canopy Realtor Association in Charlotte, North Carolina. In the late 1800s, an area known as Logtown, later reborn as Brooklyn, here in the heart of uptown Charlotte, became a beacon of hope for newly emancipated Black families. Despite being located in a less desirable, low-lying part of town with hazardous living conditions, Brooklyn blossomed into a vibrant community. It was here that Charlotte's first Black public school, the Myers Street School, opened its doors, and where pioneering institutions like the city's Black YMCA, library, and even the influential AME Zion Publishing House took shape. Brooklyn wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a thriving business center, home to a range of establishments from modest shanties and mill houses to elegant homes of Black professionals. On today's episode of Inside the Canopy Files, hosted by Canopy staff Kim Walker and Karen Lindsay, we'll rediscover this city within a city once known as Brooklyn and the people that made it come to life. We'll also examine its demise and what Charlotte has done in revitalizing and connecting the past with the promise of the future.
Joining us today to talk about this often forgotten piece of Charlotte's history is Dr. Tom Hanchett, noted Charlotte historian. He is the retired staff historian for the Levine Museum of the New South and author of 2 books, Sorting Out the New South City, and his latest book, which will be available in May, Affordable Housing in Charlotte, What One City's History Tells Us About America's Pressing Problem. Also joining us for this conversation is local architect and past Mecklenburg County Commissioner Darrel Williams, who is retired from Neighboring Concepts, a design firm he co-founded in 1996 that brings opportunity to underserved areas. Neighboring Concepts was instrumental in a number of projects, most notably the Harvey B. Gantt Center and Romare Bearden Park. Thank you both for being here today. And let's talk history first with Dr. Hanchett and then look at the present day Brooklyn with Mr. Williams. So let's just jump right in here, and I want Dr. Hanchett to paint a picture for our audience of this place called Logtown and what was the time period, what was happening at that time in this critical period of the South's redevelopment. This is right after emancipation and slavery, and how did this become this early community evolve, I should say, into what we're talking about, Brooklyn?
Well, Brooklyn was, it kind of name-checked Brooklyn, New York, which was coming into New York City as a borough, a city within a city in the 1890s. We're kind of in the center of Charlotte. If you think of where I-277 runs, we're in that area south of the skyscrapers. Mm-hmm. The early years of the 20th century were a really tense time in terms of race relations. There were new deed restrictions that were placed into the lots in the new streetcar suburbs. Mm-hmm. You're pulling people out to this new wonderful land of Elizabeth and Dilworth and Myers Park and Wesley Heights and Wilmore and places like that. And those are going to be exclusive neighborhoods. Well, what does that mean? Well, written right into the deed, this property shall be used by members of the Caucasian race only, and it will be used for a house costing not less than X number of dollars. And so it's restricting, it's excluding people based on race, but also based on economics. And Black folks who are frozen out of the suburbs say, okay, we're going to build a city within a city. The area that's now where the government center is, where the NASCAR Hall of Fame is, where the Canopy Real Estate Association has their offices, the Aquatic Center, the new Pearl Medical College and Innovation District that Wake Forest University and Atrium are collaborating on. Hard to believe, but all of that was this neighborhood of Brooklyn.
Wow. So it evolved into this cultural hub. You've got all this development. It becomes a self-sustaining community. let's talk about the residents and how they kind of went about their day. I mean, was there much interaction with the outside community, or what was the would have been Myers Park and the Wesley Heights, as you said, all of these budding suburban kind of areas that are coming around?
I would imagine there would have been interaction, because that's where the money was. If you wanted to go do a job of any kind, whether you were somebody's yard care person, or whether you were building, like Darrel Williams' family were the brick masons in the area where he grew up. And so African Americans had extensive skills, but when you came home at night, you came home to a neighborhood where everything was walkable. Your kids could walk to school. If your kid misbehaved, you knew that the kid was going to get a talking to there by somebody you knew. And then when they got home,
everybody else got involved in that. Yeah, the parents already knew.
Your minister lived down the street. 12 big brick churches in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
The AME Zion Publishing House for the entire denomination worldwide was there. So black professionals, black doctors and lawyers, and also a lot of blue collar rental housing, because African Americans were largely barred from borrowing at banks. And there wasn't a law, but it was informal. And what do you do? And so about 7% of people in Brooklyn owned their own home in the 1960s, and most of the rest of the folks were pretty much at the mercy of whatever absentee landlords provided.
Wow. So in that, before we get to the urban renewal part, and you mentioned some of the communities, businesses were thriving, schools were thriving. Basically, the city was the city within the city is growing. How were folks able to kind of conduct their lives, though, without this outside interference until the 60s? Or talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the things that happened that kind of took away that or disenfranchised people, I guess, or brought us to that point.
If you start at the beginning of Brooklyn, it's a proud neighborhood. It's got professionals. It's got really important artisans and craftspeople, ministers, moms, everything that makes a city good. But it's really without voting power. There were no African American elected officials. There are no African Americans in positions of corporate power, and so you're at a disadvantage to start off, and then those restrictive deed covenants are written by law into the real estate framework in the 1930s.
So that made it difficult for people to leave if they wanted to go out because they couldn't just buy land. Yeah. In Brooklyn, even to just build. Yeah.
Well, maybe you could buy land in Brooklyn, but you're not going to get a bank to help you. And I don't know if you paid cash for everything you ever bought as a real estate person. I sure didn't. No. And I'm realizing that that's because of things that were written into federal policy, credit mapping, trying to help banks make loans during the Great Depression. Well, certain neighborhoods got good credit ratings, and neighborhoods that had either white working class people or black people got bad credit ratings. The whole neighborhood. Yeah. That's what's known as redlining. Zoning, single family zoning. The beginnings of that are in the 1940s here in Charlotte. And Brooklyn was zoned, quote unquote, industrial, which meant developers.
So they never intended for it to be a residential. Is that, do you think that's?
Yeah, what you just said.
Okay. Wow. Any thoughts you want to add to that, Darrel?
Well, I think, what's different now compared to then is that we have black elected officials on everybody. Okay. So what they were able to get away with back then, I don't think that could ever happen today. Okay. And gentrification is a little different from urban renewal. From my perspective, I think urban renewal is usually led by the government, right? Okay. They come in and they're going to urban renew an area. Gentrification happens organically. Okay. And what happens is, and the government can do that too, but generally it's individuals selling their property to other people that coming into the neighborhood. And what happens is you're not going to have improvement in that neighborhood without some gentrification. I mean, if you don't want gentrification, you move into the worst area that nothing is going on. So that's, so you're going to have some gentrification. If your neighborhood is improving, other people are going to want to come
to it. Mm-hmm.
And they're going to offer you enough money while those who live there are going to move and go somewhere else. So that's what happens in gentrification.
So you kind of jumped ahead here and explained that for me, but that makes sense. So there was really no warning, though, for these people other than, like, if you could talk a little bit, let's go back. Talk to me about how many people were in this area, how many buildings, what was the displacement like? And how would these people have gotten this? Like, did they just get a notice?
Yep.
Like they just got something in the mail? Because if you're an absentee landlord, if the landlord's somewhere else, did he get the notice? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how.
Yep.
And so
Beatrice Thompson, who is on radio here for a long time, remembers coming home from school one day when she thinks fourth grade, and there was a notice tacked up on every door of the house on her street, and was part of this national urban renewal. What a name. Washington, right after World War II, said, let's put some money into quote unquote slum clearance. There weren't public hearings by and large. There weren't environmental review and all that, community engagement that we have now. And so when urban renewal cranked up in Brooklyn in the 1960s, it was just devastating. And Darrel Williams, you were talking about, this is something that you knew about only generally. And as you put together this history work, you found out both about the neighborhood back in the day, but also about this story of displacement.
Yeah, I moved to Charlotte in 1983. And so that's almost 35, 36 years before we got involved in this project with the medical school. So prior to that, I had served 8 years on the Board of County Commissioners, and I heard bits and pieces about Brooklyn, but I did not understand the gravity of what happened in Brooklyn until we got involved in this project. Okay. To see the highways coming through and tearing the community apart. And
how many? Talk again. I think earlier we were discussing the number of people.
It was 1,700 individuals. It was 200 families, 200 businesses, and 12 churches. Were basically wiped out. And I think several people just relocated to other parts of the city.
Okay.
Is what happened. Yeah. The buildings got destroyed.
Wow. Yeah. And how many now are surviving? If we were, walking in this area, can we see?
As far as the buildings go, there are 4 buildings left. There were 1,000 households. That's the figure I remember. Darrel Williams has a much better head for figures than I do, but 1,000 families displaced, and 4 buildings still stand, and they're beautiful. The Grace AME Zion Church on Brevard Street from 1900, the Mecklenburg Investment Company building, a cooperative building built by Black professionals for Black professionals, also on Brevard Street. The McCrory YMCA, which needs some love right now. It's on Caldwell Street. It's empty, named for the president of JCSU, Reverend H.L. McCrory. And then the beautiful Second Ward High School Gymnasium. Used to be multiple schools serving the neighborhood. All that's left is the gymnasium built by A.G. Odell, the leading modernist architect in the South. And that's been recently renovated with the Historic Landmarks Commission and Park and Rec.
And Neighboring Concepts was involved in the renovation.
Wow. Okay.
So I want to understand, what was the purpose or the goal of the urban renewal? Other than displacing the people, what was the plan behind it?
It's hard to say this, but I found writings in the newspapers as early as the 19-teens that white folks were jealous of Brooklyn. And they, I can find this and send it to you. I don't have it exactly in my head, but that the better classes in Charlotte are in agreement that the lands owned, the lands of Brooklyn, would do much better in white hands, and they were going to work on that. And it took a while until the Housing Act of 1949, then it was amended in 1954. It was called a Housing Act, but it allowed political entities, government entities, to tear down neighborhoods, and you didn't have to reuse the land for housing. And in Charlotte, that's exactly what happened.
Wow. So, but this was also happening in other cities.
Every city in the United States.
So it was almost like they were targeting communities that had no infrastructure, then that had to put together their own infrastructure to build their own quote unquote city within a city. Once they start thriving, then there's this plan now to take it apart.
Yeah.
And that's all over the South?
All over the United States.
Did it just happen it started in the 60s? And just
the planning starts in the 50s.
Okay.
And some of it is wound up in interstate highway construction, which is planned in the same way. We're going to take land for a higher and better use. And that's a term that real estate people throw around today. And if you know this history, it's kind of a scary term because it's an assumption that there is a higher and better use than people using the land. And there was a cult of the expert in America in the years after World War II, that the experts had won World War II and the experts were taking us to the moon. And doggone, if they think they should tear down a big chunk of our city, well, do it. And there was a tremendous backlash. That's when the historic preservation movement starts. That's when having public hearings that slow things down and require community input. That's when anti-redlining laws, the Fair Housing Act in 1968, the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977 says you can't do stuff to neighborhoods. You have to do it with neighborhoods. And it's a lesson that you'd think we would have learned. And
I was going to say, have we learned that lesson? Because Charlotte continues to redevelop itself, revitalize itself. It looks at a section and, you drive down one street and it's one building here, and then 2 weeks later, it's all cleared. How do we go about doing this thoughtfully? How do we go about doing, from a historical and from your perspectives, how should development happen in a more thoughtful way that actually has an eye towards, preserving that history?
I think it should, and I think it depends on the individuals and the citizens, because going back to what happened in other cities and what happened here, I think the result is not having enough or any Black representation, and so that's different now. But even with Black representation, if folks don't show up and complain about the process, then they'll get it done the easy way. But now I do think our city, our planning department, and the county, they have a process now that's a lot different than what was in the past. But it still takes citizens to speak out and get involved in their community, because if they don't, then things will just keep happening the way that they don't want it to happen.
So what's the vision now for Brooklyn?
Well, neither Darrel or I can speak directly to this. We were involved very early on in different ways with some of the very early planning, but we're not the people in charge now. So I want to make that really clear. But as I read the newspapers and as I follow, what's going on in the media, about 17 acres in the old Brooklyn urban renewal land, out of many more acres that were there, 17 acres assembled by the county. 2015, they signed an agreement with a three-part partnership. Monty Ritchie and Conformity Corporation of Charlotte, Don Peebles, who's one of the leading African-American real estate developers in the world out of D.C., and then a third firm that has a lot of technical expertise called Stantec. And those 17 acres are slated for redevelopment. There'll be a smaller Marshall Park. There'll be a lot of residential opening onto the park, retail, office. And just recently, in February of 2025, they announced that the first piece of this on Brooklyn Village Way, what a great name, at McDowell Street, will be 250 units of affordable housing. Affordable housing for people at very low income, but also people like teachers and firefighters and
Workforce,
police trainees and folks like that.
Okay.
And so that's the vision. It's unfolding slowly.
What's that timeline? You said it's mostly, I mean, we're seeing some of that development now, but.
Well, the original papers were signed in 2015, which is a while ago.
Okay.
And the newest thing, they're talking about beginning construction in 2026. I don't know. I have no inside knowledge. I do know that those 250 units of affordable housing were not part of the original plan. And to speak to what Darrel Williams was talking about, people complained. Mm-hmm. People went to their city council. They went to their county commission. They said, this is not right. And we are short of affordable housing by some 30,000 units in Charlotte. And this is the center city where you can walk to jobs. Mm-hmm. We got to have affordable housing.
Yeah.
And I'm just really impressed that those 250 units, which is a drop in the bucket, but it's a drop we didn't have.
And if more people go out, perhaps that could change. Yeah. It could go up, because considering that it sounds like it's evolving still. Now, the medical school is a big piece of this. So can you talk a little bit about how, I guess, the commemoration of Brooklyn and how that's going to interweave with the new medical center, the Pearl, and all of that?
Well, the leaders of the medical school, Atrium and Wake Forest, and Wexford is the developer. They wanted to make sure that Brooklyn was remembered in this project. What they did not want is to build all these new buildings and everybody just go along their way and never know what this was in the past. Mm-hmm. And so they wanted to make sure that history was remembered. And so doing that, they wanted to also make sure that it was connected by some kind of path where you can walk from Pearl Street Park, go through the Innovation District, through the new medical school to McDowell, and then turn north and start walking toward Brooklyn to connect Brooklyn, what's called Brooklyn Village now, to the new innovation corridor. So that's the plan. And so in doing that, we came up with the term purposeful walk to make sure that if you take that walk, you will have a much better understanding of what Brooklyn was and who some of the key individuals were that lived there, than you would have without taking that walk. So,
and that'll start where you said
it'll probably start in Pearl Street Park,
and then kind of weave through
the new
medical. Okay.
Through the buildings, and and end up going to the new Brooklyn Village area.
And kind of be an interactive, or
it'll be a little bit of everything. Now, again, as Tom said earlier, I haven't been involved personally in 3 years. Okay. And so the concept is what I'm talking about, what we came up with as an initial concept, and that was to make sure that there was some audio, video, some interactive type of activities along the way, some stories that you could hear from individuals that lived there. So you would really get a good feel for Brooklyn and what it was. Even the graphics to see the map and the highways coming through and tearing it apart. I mean, just educating people, because I was here for 35 years and I didn't know that the interstate came through and divided. I thought Brooklyn was just on the other side of Brookshire.
Yeah. So just touching on, not just looking just at Brooklyn, but I just to get some context, the city, here's Brooklyn, but were there other areas, Black neighborhoods still budding around Charlotte as well that people could
there was not just one. This was the most important neighborhood in terms of business buildings and institutional buildings and churches and such like. But early on, there was the Cherry neighborhood adjacent to Myers Park, which is actually older than Myers Park. It begun in the 1890s. If you go out the northwest side of town to the historic West End, there's the beautiful Victorian Tower of Johnson C. Smith University, and that area has been known as Biddleville. The original name of the college was Biddle Institute, all of these places that used to be scattered around the city, all of them are changing. Greer Heights, a neighborhood on the south side of Charlotte, African American for decades, and is now seeing the same kind of rising property values that you see other places. If you own your land, that's kind of cool, but if you're a renter, it's now hard to rent in Cherry or in Greer Heights.
So those folks, though, that were displaced in Brooklyn, though, at least had other areas of the city to go to that obviously grew as a result, I'm sure. Lots of changes. We think now, I think of West Boulevard as being almost entirely African American.
Yes.
That
was a new thing in the 1960s. And when the Brooklyn folk moved out to a neighborhood, a corridor that had black and white neighborhoods. A friend of mine, Netta Ford, with Community Building Initiative, grew up in Seversville, right near JCSU. That was a white neighborhood until the Brooklyn folks got pushed out, and she was one of the newcomers who moved into Seversville in the 1970s. So real estate patterns change. And sometimes it's a tough story, kind of like what we're telling you here. But also, there's a sense of possibility if you know this history.
Yeah, it's almost like
we don't like what we got now, we can make it change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like Brooklyn is coming full circle. This whole story of it's bittersweet, but it has come full circle, and it sounds like we're on the cusp of doing some good things, some positive things. So if you had any takeaways or any thoughts to add about thoughtful development, about what we developers and real estate realtors should be doing and thinking about when we are growing a city, just hearing from both of you, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's being a part of the growth. It's influencing what it becomes. It's not just sitting back and waiting and reacting. It's being a part of the decision making that influences what's going to happen. So that's what I would recommend that realtors do. I mean, go down to the Board of County Commissioners and sit down and listen when you see something coming up on the agenda about Brooklyn or about other areas in the city, and get involved.
Okay.
Yeah, listening. Part of it is to speak clearly and get involved and be knowledgeable. Part of it is to hold your elected officials and the non-elected folks who make the government run every day to the fact that you got to listen. Stuff that is done with listening, with a mixture of voices, is always better. It lasts longer. It's more fun to be in. And so that's the lesson of this history.
Wow. So this is do you have anything?
Well, I did want to ask a question. I just thought it was important to point out Canopy's right next to Pearl Park. And aren't there some things built into Pearl Park that commemorate the Brooklyn neighborhood?
There is sculpture that has names and words from people who were affiliated with Brooklyn. Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation put that together with help from now County Commissioner Arthur Griffin. He's been an activist in this city for decades and decades. The Pearl Street Park Pavilion with the stonework has history panels, and that's part of telling the story. We're a city of newcomers. Where a lot of us are young people who haven't come up hearing these stories. A lot of us are coming from other parts of the United States, and we got to keep telling the stories.
So speaking of that, let's just touch on that a little bit, because we've got a movement up front where history is almost being relegated to the back, and only the good parts should be told. What are your thoughts there? I mean, how do we teach this when we're getting to the place where we're not supposed to teach it, so to speak? What are you?
I think that's foolish.
if you don't think about what mistakes have been made, you will make them again.
Going to repeat them again.
And the story of urban renewal is a story of top-down government, and we should be too smart to have that kind of simple, powerful people take over the running our lives thing, and it doesn't work very well. And that was one of the lessons of urban renewal, was that when you had just the experts involved, just the people with power involved, you created something that wasn't very pleasant to be in. The Brooklyn area today, 60 years later, is mostly parking lots.
Yeah. So
we don't need that much parking.
There's still work that can be, there's still stuff that can be put in there, is what you're saying. There's much work still to be done. Yeah.
Got to know the history.
Wow.
Yeah, I would say that, history provides inspiration, and as an architect, we've tried to make sure we understand an area that we're designing in to see if there's anything good that can come out of history that can influence that design. And so history is very, very important. I mean, without history, you have nothing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this is a very, very poignant conversation. And I think this is you've passed me this wonderful quote. It's a great way to kind of wrap this. Eric Orozco with Neighboring Concepts said, "No city in the U.S. has an opportunity to redress the injustices of urban renewal quite like Charlotte today. By restoring a diverse, economically recharging, and educationally inspiring environment, today we have an unprecedented opportunity to heal the erasures urban renewal has wrought on our city with mid-century planning. We have an amazing opportunity before us to restore Brooklyn's place in the thriving fabric of our center city." And I think that speaks to what's happening. I think it's, as I said, bittersweet to hear the history and then now to see it come full circle, that the good, as you said, the studying of the history is brought, like, what can we bring forward that's good and leave for others to learn from. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate Dr. Hanchett. I appreciate you, Darrel Williams. And thank you, Karen, for sitting here supporting me and jumping into some questions. And we thank you to our audience for listening. If you want to know more about Charlotte's history, we invite you to jump on HistorySouth.org. Yes, HistorySouth.org.
The first book called Sorting Out the New South City. The new book coming out in May, Affordable Housing in Charlotte.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you
both.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes,
we appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Inside the Canopy Files, presented by Canopy Realtor Association in Charlotte, North Carolina. Connect with us online at carolinahome.com.